October 1944. A city was divided, its loyalties fractured. But unusual for this period in world history, the fissure had nothing to do with the war still raging across the world in two separate theaters. It had to do with baseball. The 41st incarnation of Major League Baseball's World Series was about to begin, and the residents of one city in particular were riveted to the going event, the city that both participants happened to call home, the National League's St. Louis Cardinals, and the representatives from the American League, the St. Louis Browns. The Cardinals marched into the 1944 World Series in possession of their third straight pennant, and were aiming to bring home the championship trophy for the second time in 3 years. World War II had sapped some of the team's depth, but the core of their championship teams was mostly intact, including 1944 NL MVP Marty Marion, Whitey Kurowski, the Cooper brothers Morton Walker, and, most terrifying of all, future Hall of Famer and 1943 National League MVP, Stan the Man Musial. The Browns brought with them no true stars, no history of championships, and no real expectations of besting their crosstown rivals. The American League pennant they won in 1944 was their first. It would also be their last. 9 years later, they would be gone, not just from St. Louis, but from baseball. When discussing the history of baseball in St. Louis, it can be tempting to focus only on the teams still around to add to that history. The Cardinals have been postseason fixtures, winners of 19 National League pennants and 11 World Series championships. They're the closest thing we have to baseball royalty, west of a certain pinstriped empire, at least. To fans in St. Louis and the surrounding region, the games, players, and moments that make up the fabric of the Cardinals' story are unforgettable. The history of the St. Louis Browns, on the other hand, has nearly been erased. A team no longer in existence, whose existence was barely acknowledged even when they were. And while baseball and the historians who shaped the legacy of America's favorite pastime have not purposefully forgotten the Browns, they certainly have not tried too hard to remember them. But just because the Browns' story is not well known, doesn't mean it's not worth telling. It's a story of the perpetual underdog, ceaselessly working to improve both their success on the field and their standing in the town they called home. The championship clash with the Cardinals in 1944 was their opportunity to be taken seriously, not just in St. Louis, but throughout the entire baseball world. To be taken seriously, that would be a welcome change.
First of all, there are a lot of people that don't even know there was a St. Louis Browns. When you tell some people here in Baltimore who the Browns were, really, you know, I didn't realize that.
You played for both the Cardinals and the Browns. What was the difference?
Is there much difference between night and day?
Well, one thing that's really good, we haven't lost a game in 60 years.
It was a weird operation. I remember one night when I owned the club, I was selling tickets. We had a large and extensive organization. And somebody came up and he wanted to buy 8 seats. Well, I knew he came from out of town. I said, where would you like to sit? He said, we'd like to sit best seats in the house. I said, would you like to sit at second base? We're not using it this year.
The entire operation was probably the least affluent of anybody in baseball.
And I think because they were struggling for so many of those later years to be a team that could make St. Louis proud, they were sort of the Cubs of St. Louis.
I mean, there was even a Browns fan club in Chicago, and they had the slogan, we're not downhearted, we're brownhearted.
Do I worry about myself that I'm so fascinated by the Browns? Yes, a little bit.
We weren't doing that good anyway, so that was a nice diversion for us, actually.
Look, they were losers. They lost 1,000 more games than they won. They won 3,400 games. They lost 4,400 games. But it's a collection of players. It's a collection of people, stories, and teams.
The Browns arrived in the Gateway City in 1902 from Milwaukee. At the time, St. Louis was the 4th largest city in the United States, boasting a population of nearly 600,000. The city had been founded on the banks of the mighty Mississippi River by French colonists as a fur trading post in the middle of the 18th century. 150 years later, the bet those early settlers had made on St. Louis's geographic advantages had been proven correct, and the city had established itself as a major trade hub and industrial center.
You know, we see the active riverfront being so much a part of industry and so much a part of the driving forces of the city.
The construction of the Eads Bridge in 1874 helped link the existing water transportation routes to the emerging transcontinental railroad network, which was growing in importance as a mover of both goods and people.
That was a huge deal for St. Louis because now they can control how they get goods from one place to another. You know, again, they're a major brewing nation. You know, they've got goods in the way of all of the manufacturing things, the furniture, the clothing, all of those things that they want to get out of the city. So all of these very important parts of St. Louis history that were industrial in nature really put them on the map. And then they bring in the World's Fair.
St. Louis was awarded both the 1904 World's Fair and the Summer Olympic Games later that same year, a sign the city was starting to be seen as a major cultural center as well. The people of St. Louis don't talk much about the World's Fair these days, but in 1904, it meant a city had truly arrived. In a day where there was not nearly as much competition for the entertainment dollar, it was not unthinkable that the residents and businesses of St. Louis could support two Major League Baseball teams. In fact, it was expected they could and would.
And that was the way St. Louisans looked at it. Hey, we're important. We just had a World's Fair in 1904. We're the fourth largest city in America. Damn straight we get a team.
And it couldn't be said the Browns didn't do their part to attract a fan base immediately. In their inaugural season in 1902, they went 78-58, good for second place in the American League. Prior to the season getting underway, they also fired the first salvo in their nascent feud with the already established Cardinals by luring away several of their top stars, future Hall of Famer shortstop Bobby Wallace, future Hall of Famer and 1901 batting champ Jesse Burkett, and three of the Cards' best pitchers, counting on familiar faces to help fill the grandstands and the box scores immediately.
They raided some of the Cardinals' assets, so to speak, and tempted these players to come over and play on the American League side. While the Browns didn't quite have immediate success, they were luring some players that were popular. Their ballpark, while dilapidated at the beginning, they had invested some money to make it a nice place to enjoy a ball game. So the Browns are really the in vogue team to enjoy really in the early 1900s.
They were the better team between the Cardinals and the Browns for those first 2 decades. And it was the evolution of a love affair with the Browns because people wanted to see the winner. The Browns were the winners in the town at that time.
The Browns' story and a hometown rivalry had officially begun. But at least early on, this rivalry would have very little to do with wins and losses.
In other cities, we think about Chicago, for example, with the White Sox and the Cubs. It's a geographical rivalry. It's the North Siders versus the South Siders. In St. Louis, the ballparks were blocks apart. You didn't identify with one team because of where you lived.
So this is a rivalry based on the way the two leagues were set up, where you had Ban Johnson's American League competing with the National League. This is a rivalry not for who can win on the field, as who can win at the turnstiles and who can get more column inches in the newspaper, whose baseball gloves do little kids buy? Do they buy the George Sisler or do they buy the Frankie Frisch? So yeah, I mean, it was a rivalry, but I don't know any other sport that has rivalries of two teams that don't play each other. But it was a fierce rivalry. It was a rivalry of the heart.
The next several years were up and down for the new ball club. In 1908, they were in the race for the pennant all the way until the final days of the season. But then, from 1910 through 1912, they strung together 3 straight seasons with more than 100 losses. 1 step forward, 3 steps back. However, the sale of the team to Philip de Catsby Ball in 1916 would portend big things ahead for the Browns, on and off the field. Ball was a multimillionaire ice and coal magnate who wasn't interested in making a profit with the Browns and rarely did. He viewed the Browns as a hobby, something to take his mind off work. meaning that, just like many of his players, he didn't always keep his eye on the ball. Never was that more clear than in his dealings with former ally turned antagonist, Branch Rickey. Rickey had managed the Browns for several years before moving into a front office role. He was already developing a reputation as a visionary in a sport defined by stasis, but Rickey knew that there wasn't room in the Browns' office for more than one dominant voice.
Phil Ball gave Branch Rickey certain privileges to really run and direct the ball club. However, Branch Rickey still had to work through Phil Ball for all of his decision-making authority, and that frustrated Rickey. An opening came about with the St. Louis Cardinals, and Branch Rickey took advantage of an opportunity to negotiate out of his contract, and would not just change the Cardinals' fortunes, it would change the business of baseball forever.
After he returned from World War I in 1919, it was obvious either he or Ball would have to go, and it wasn't going to be the owner. Ball's war of ego with Rickey would quickly lead him into making a great short-term business deal that would have negative long-term effects on the organization. After the 1919 season, the Cardinals were through playing in their firetrap of a home stadium and came to Ball pleading to move into the Browns Stadium, the venerated Sportsman's Park, as their tenant. Ball agreed to take on the Cardinals, but the favorable terms outlined in the agreement ensured the Cardinals would pay minimal rent. With a favorable lease in place, they were free to sell their stadium and use the windfall to fund Rickey's longtime dream, developing a true farm system.
Branch Rickey had an eye for raw potential and undiscovered talent. He could find the player that would grow into the major league, pitcher or hitter, but he couldn't outbid these more powerful and richer teams at auction for that same player that was, on the cusp of already being a major league talent. So the Cardinals had this idea to affiliate clubs of minor league teams to get talent to the major league level.
Branch Rickey had originally wanted to start the farm system with the Browns, and he had talked to Phil Ball about it. And he was, laying it out when he was with the Browns. And then he had the falling out with Phil Ball. It's the single most important turning point in Browns history when the Cardinals became co-tenants, because the Browns got not much rent from the Cardinals, but the Cardinals got freed from that responsibility and they were able to focus on baseball. And focus on baseball they did.
They create all these great players that then lead to the great teams of the Cardinals starting in 26, 28, 30, 31, 34, and all the appearances in the World Series in the 40s. Branch Rickey creates what has become foundation of that great franchise. So it really comes back to this one critical man and his actions and how they kind of turned the tide as he switched sides from the Browns to the Cardinals.
While the Cardinals spent on their future, Ball put massive amounts of the Browns' capital towards improvements to Sportsman's Park. He even publicly boasted that the updated stadium would host a World Series by 1926. However, stadiums don't win championships, teams do. Money poured into Sportsman's Park was money that couldn't be put into improving the roster, meaning the Browns were never able to get over the Bronx-shaped hump looming above them in the American League standings. Somewhat ironically, Ball's prediction did prove true. The World Series was played at Sportsman's Park in 1926. Of course, it wasn't the Browns who hosted, but their tenant, the Cardinals, upsetting the Yankees in 7 games.
With a 1-run lead at Yankee Stadium, Babe Ruth was caught stealing for the final out to deliver the first World Championship in Cardinal history.
That World Series victory by the Cardinals would flip the fan base in a city that has been loyal to the Browns for most of the 1920s. Ball's blunders would ensure St. Louis bled Cardinals red from then on out. But you can't say the Browns didn't make somewhat of an impression. The 20s were defined by the longest sustained on-field success in team history. They didn't make it to a World Series, 1944 was still years away, but they would showcase their best players, field their best teams, become the only team to throw a no-hitter on consecutive days, and look to be on the way to becoming a perennial power on the diamond, with much of that on-field accomplishment fueled by the greatest Brownie of them all, the incomparable George Sisler. The 1920s were the best years of the Browns' history, filled with big seasons and big moments.
During the 20s, the Browns had one of the best teams in baseball. You know, we had the outfield of Kenny Williams, Baby Doll Jacobson, Johnny Tobin. 5 straight years, they're the only team in baseball that the same 3 players ran the outfield and hit over 300. So they were this offensive dynamo led by George Sisler, the greatest Browns of them all.
He came up as a pitcher in 1915, but mediocre results, though he did manage to outduel Walter Big Train Johnson on 2 occasions, and an uncanny batting eye combined to land him at first for the rest of his time with the Browns. While Sisler's power numbers trailed behind Babe Ruth and the myth-building bombs he was swatting, they were impressive for the time. However, his real offensive skill was simply making contact.
The statistics, when I started getting older and started looking at some of the information that was out there about him, it astounded me. In the years 19, 20, 21, and 22, he averaged 400. I don't know that that's been done by anybody in the league.
Sisler would retire with a career batting average of .340, racking up over 200 hits in 6 different seasons, and amazingly collected 257 hits in 1920, which stood as the Major League record for 84 years until Ichiro Suzuki broke it in 2004. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1939, the undisputed best player in Browns history. However, that distinction comes with a price. With no current team claiming him, neither Sisler's name nor his career are as immortalized as his contemporaries. Although, in a sign that all rivalries thaw with the passing of enough decades, the Cardinals have honored Sisler with a statue outside their ballpark in a show of St. Louis solidarity.
We honor Sisler because there's not a team that keeps his flame alive, that really honors his legacy.
We as a family obviously wanted him to always get the credit he deserved. Here, the Cardinals are acknowledging that this happened, that this ball player played in the St. Louis area for a St. Louis team. Words can't really express, you know, how grateful we were for that happening.
They did put the statue out in front, and that's kind of nice, you know, because whenever I meet friends to go to the game, I always meet at Sisler's statue, not Musial's. So that's really more fun to me anyway.
As Sisler went, so did the Browns. And in no season was this more apparent than in 1922, Sisler's best statistical season. He hit .420, knocked in 105 runs, and led the league in runs, triples, and stolen bases. The Browns would finish 93 and 61 in 1922, a fantastic record that still had them finishing 1 game behind an emerging Yankees dynasty. The rest of the decade was marked by generally good results. But good was about the highest compliment you could have paid to even the best Browns teams of this era. As the 1920s faded into the 30s, the country became locked into what would eventually be called the Great Depression. It's a name that just as easily could have been ascribed to the Browns organization during this decade.
I think the fact that the Cardinals were winning made it a down decade. Not only were the Cardinals winning, they had the Gas House Gang, which was getting a lot of ink, and they were playing a more exciting brand of baseball than the Browns were. Plus, it was the Depression, and attendance was terrible, below 100,000 a year, and it was really bad times. Pictures of Sportsman's Park back then, it looks bleak even, The diamond looks dry, and the crowds are sparse, and the sun's beating down, and it's like, how do you sell baseball in that sort of market?
Among the lowlights of this period in time were playing a game in front of only 33 fans in 1933 and drawing only 80,922 fans for the entirety of the 1935 season. The latter achievement still stands as an all-time Major League low. But just when they thought they had hit bottom, the rest of the American League tossed them a shovel. In 1939, they finished the year 43 and 111, a staggering 64.5 games out of first place.
Could you imagine, we're going to the ball game tonight, knowing your team is 64.5 games out of first place. What are you going to look for?
The Browns ended up being caught in a vicious catch-22. They needed good ball players to attract large-paying crowds, and they needed large-paying crowds to afford good ball players. During the 1930s, they didn't have much of either. Attendance woes begat baseball woes, and vice versa.
But it's also when they had to start getting innovative. They started doing the fun things. They started having the Browns Brigade, I believe, right around then. Let the kids come in free.
They played 154 divided by 2. They played all those games, and you could go to all of them. and you usually sat either down the right field foul line or maybe in the right field pavilion. Or you might have to start in the boonies, but after an inning or two, it didn't make any difference because they only had a handful of people there, and you could move down into the box seats.
Kids could take the streetcar. Sportsman Park was served by great streetcar lines, so that at least planted the seed for the Browns fans that would be in the stands in 1944.
But while kids were enjoying free baseball, the rest of St. Louis was struggling. The passing of the Volstead Act and subsequent implementation of Prohibition had already wreaked havoc on St. Louis's many thriving brewing operations, and its other industries would suffer major losses under the crushing weight of the Depression years.
And Hoovervilles grew up right along the riverfront, so those shanty towns that were part of the cultural landscape of the country, really. They started just south of the Municipal Free Bridge, which we now know as the MacArthur Bridge, and went south for blocks and blocks. And they were their own cities. I mean, they were literally where people lived and spent all of their life just in those Hoovervilles.
This economic crisis certainly helped explain the team's attendance problems, although probably not their inability to score or prevent runs. However, in the midst of this particularly forgettable stretch in team history, a few bright spots began to appear on the horizon in the form of new leadership and even a new look. In 1936, the team was sold to a new ownership group, including majority stockholder Donald Lee Barnes.
And he came in with some innovative actions to try to strengthen the financial woes of the team. He issued shareholder stock to many people and was really trying to put the Browns back on the map in the American League.
While Barnes was focusing on the finances, new general manager and minority owner Bill DeWitt Sr., a man whose family name would come to be synonymous with baseball in St. Louis, was busy bolstering the roster.
Bill DeWitt was a protege of Branch Rickey, and it was Branch Rickey who guided Bill DeWitt over to the Browns.
You see DeWitt you can kind of see him hurriedly trying to build the farm system, and the Browns did, by the late 30s, early 40s, have a pretty formidable farm club system.
But before they could transform the team's outlook, they first had to transform their look with a new emblem. A fan contest was held, and the winning entry would be the apotheosis of St. Louis, the statue of King Louis IX of France atop his horse. This statue, still standing today on Art Hill in Forest Park, was a remnant of the 1904 World's Fair, and in the days before the Gateway Arch, was considered the foremost symbol of the city. The apotheosis version of the Browns logo included 9 orange and brown vertical stripes, representing the 9 players on the field, and 8 stars, representing the 8 teams in the American League.
How this represented the city. Everybody, Art Hill was the focal point of the World's Fair and everybody's remembrance of Forest Park. Louis IX became the symbol of St. Louis. It just is the ultimate combining it all together into one symbol. And there really isn't a symbol like that across Major League Baseball.
Armed with their new logo, Donald Barnes and Bill DeWitt Sr. were determined to change the fortunes of what was fastly becoming St. Louis's official second baseball team. And in fact, these men and the manager they would hire in 1941, Luke Sewell, would indeed play large parts in shaking up the roster and building the team that would soon challenge the Cardinals for the 1944 World Series crown. But before the city's 2 teams could go to battle, the world would go to war. The United States stayed on the sidelines for the conflict's opening stanzas, but would join the fray after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. At that point, everyone, including the players, could see what was ahead.
It was quite a day, because everybody knew that we were all going. It was just a matter of when and where. We both knew that I was a candidate. Age felt pretty good. So you're going to have to do something. Right. You can't hide.
At first, many in the sport feared that the war would derail baseball, as it had during the First World War 20 years earlier. After all, there were more important things to spend time, money, energy, and resources on than sports. But those fears turned out to be unfounded. In President Roosevelt's famous Green Light letter to Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, he not only called for baseball to play on, but also encouraged more night games to give the hardworking people behind the war effort a well-deserved distraction and break.
At least it kept the game in front of the people and gave the people something to do during the most dismal time of their life. Morale was a big issue, and rightfully so, because we were taking some big hits early on, you know, losing a lot of pretty good guys.
Of course, playing on seemed like a difficult task at times, with many of the players choosing to serve their country in the most direct way possible, joining the armed forces and going off to war. In all, more than 500 players, including some of the bigger stars of the day, would sign up for military service, leaving the ranks back home on the diamond rather depleted.
What we got a kick out of were the guys that replaced us. Under normal circumstances, some of them were laughable.
One exception was the St. Louis Browns. While many other teams lost key contributors up and down the lineup and in their rotations, the Browns roster remained relatively intact.
The Browns didn't have that many players who left the organization to go to war. A lot of it was because they were 4Fs. I mean, they were had some hardship or physical situation.
This combination of only a few players lost to the war effort, a more strategic and driven front office, and Luke Sewell's new management style paved the way for the team to improve drastically into the 1940s.
The war was like the great leveler. It's like, okay, everybody's going to sort of be equal now, and we'll see who really wins. I mean, that was their one opportunity, and they did it.
By 1944, the team was ready to not only take a shot at their crosstown rivals, but a crack at immortality. As the 1944 season dawned, the St. Louis Browns were determined to be overlooked and forgotten no more, and they would make themselves hard to ignore from the start, beginning the season with 9 straight wins. Though the Browns were frontrunners for most of the season, at one point they were in first place for 70 consecutive days, the season still came down to the final day. But after beating the Yankees 5-2, and with the Detroit Tigers' loss earlier in the afternoon, the Browns had done it. They had clinched their first and only pennant.
I think that the delirium that must have been the last 3 games of the 1944 season, that delirium must have been just, you know, a mixture of happiness, glee, pinch me, I can't believe I'm seeing this. But imagine a team that nobody had expected anything out of. You know, they only lose. They only have bad luck. And all of a sudden they're in the winner's circle. You're just waiting for something bad to happen. And then when it doesn't happen, you know, when they pulled ahead with each out, everybody just went crazy. I think those final 4 innings, when the Browns wrapped up that game to be American League champions, I think that's the finest moment in St. Louis baseball history.
Their reward? A World Series matchup with the team that shared their city, their stadium, and their fans, who also happened to be one of the most dominant teams of the decade.
I keep thinking how the fan must have just been incredulous that here's the Browns have their one chance and they have to beat the Cardinals. You know, that's just sort of like dumb luck.
They were winners. They were, you know, evolving dynasty in baseball. You know, Stan Musial, Whitey Kurowski, the Cooper brothers, Martin Walker, Marty Marion. They were strong.
In fact, they were called the Running Redbirds, and they would run away not only with the World Series championship in '42, but they would win 100 games again in '43 and '44 and return to the World Series in both seasons. It would be 3 consecutive World Series appearances and 3 consecutive 100-win seasons for the St. Louis Cardinals.
Perhaps the only similarity between the lineup cards of the Browns and that of the Cardinals was that they were both scratched in pencil. While the Cardinals roster was stacked with household names and future Hall of Famers, the Browns were a ragtag group of part-time role players and wartime overachievers, including Mike Krivich, the pride of Mount Olive, Illinois, who was the only starter to hit over 300 that year. He hit 301.
The Browns were this underdog. You know, it was like, hey, they made it. They pulled it off. They were there.
It's interesting when we think about how St. Louis fans responded to this World Series. Stan Musial himself even felt that the city was pulling for the Browns to win, even though he knew it was a Cardinals town. The fans were pulling for the underdog. They wanted to see the Brownies win at least one.
While the fans busied themselves choosing sides, players and team officials kept occupied by learning just how different playing in a series without a visiting team would be.
In those days, you know, they had one bat boy. The bat boys didn't travel, they stayed there. So they had the same core of bat boys, and they changed uniforms between innings.
I think the losers got maybe 2,700 that year. I might be wrong, but it was something like that. The bat boy got partial shares from both teams, so he wound up, in effect, getting more money than maybe some of the losing players.
You know, even the managers, Billy Southworth and Luke Sewell, they had an arrangement because one was always home, one was always away. They shared the same apartment. And then all of a sudden, they got to play each other, and they had to find out, wait a minute, who's going to get the apartment, who's going to have to get another room?
You know, that was the first World Series controversy over where the manager's mother-in-law would sleep, because Southworth apparently had a mother-in-law who was coming into town. He didn't want to go for a hotel room, and he told Sewell that, you know, the apartment is mine. Sewell had a wife and 2 kids. He didn't want to go for a hotel either, and they finally flipped a coin.
As allegiances and battle lines were drawn, the Gateway City came alive as the middle of the country became the center of the baseball universe. Hailed as the Streetcar Series, the city buzzed with excitement and anticipation as the 1944 Fall Classic approached.
In my opinion, the 1944 World Series was the pinnacle of baseball in St. Louis. It was all coming from one ballpark of the 2 teams from one city. It's never gotten more about St. Louis baseball than the 6 games of the 1944 World Series.
As the series got underway, both clubs went out swinging, and for the most part, missing. In what would be a recurring theme for the entire series, the strikeout reigned supreme in Game 1. With Denny Galehouse towing the mound for the Browns and Mort Cooper on the hill for the Cardinals, hits were hard to come by. Cooper would only allow 2, with one proving decisive, as George McQuinn's 2-run homer put the Browns ahead for good. It was a historic blast in more ways than one. Little did fans realize, McQuinn's round tripper would turn out to be the Browns' only World Series home run in team history. The Cards would rebound in the second game of the series, but not without having to play a little longer than expected. After a string of errant defensive plays gave the Redbirds an early lead, the Browns managed to even the score 2-2 after 9, sending the game into extra innings, where Cardinals backup catcher Ken O'Day plated the winning run in the 11th. Hardly strangers to heartbreak, the Browns stormed back in Game 3. Jack Kramer chalked up 10 strikeouts en route to a 6-2 Browns victory. In addition to being the most lopsided win of the series, it also served as a high-water mark of sorts, not just for the Brownies' season, but for the 52-year history of the franchise. From there on out, the series would shift decisively and dramatically to the team sporting the birds on the bat. In Game 4, Musial was the man, launching a 2-run blast in the first and leading the Redbirds to a 5-1 triumph. The next day, no pitch counts meant no off days. Cooper and Galehouse would lock horns again for another pitcher's duel. Like Game 1, the 2 aces were determined to make it a tough day for hitters, but a relatively easy one for the manual scoreboard operators of Sportsman's Park. This time, Cooper and the Cards prevailed, 2-0, on the strength of his 7-hit shutout. By then, the tide had turned, as the clock ticked loudly and inevitably toward midnight on the Browns' Cinderella season. The Browns' offense was a no-show again in Game 6, losing 3-1 and dropping the World Series 4-2.
It really was a pretty closely contested World Series, but the Browns' offense just sputtered out at the wrong time of the season.
And they just didn't hit. There's got to be some offensive exploits. And there really weren't. I mean, the Browns won 2 games, but that was all they could manage. I mean, that's just, it just adds a little bit of intrigue, I mean, to the whole Browns story, that they got beat by, you know, the team that they rented the stadium to. Just like, what rotten luck, but.
Fans were free to speculate about what could have been and how the Browns' inability to grab control of tightly contested Game 2 would impact their fortunes in the series and the club's future in the seasons to come. But at the time, few realized how quickly and convincingly the Browns' window of opportunity would slam shut.
One of the surprising things about the Browns' win in 1944 was how quickly they sort of regressed to the mean of being a losing team once again. It's almost like those TV shows where a fairy waves a magic wand and somebody's going to the ball, I guess Cinderella or something, and then at midnight they return to their old state. It was in the Browns' DNA to be losing. And so the DNA took hold by 1946.
For the better part of a decade, the club's balance sheet was a rather dire yet accurate reflection of their performance on the field. The root cause was easy to pinpoint. Not enough fans in the grandstands, and even less money in the bank. Bad decisions off the field led to bad results on it, as the Browns were forced to sell off their best players to keep creditors at bay.
You know, their foundation wasn't strong because they were always searching for money, and that does have an impact. Again, everybody was cash strapped. You know, they would be selling players. Vern Stevens wins the American League home run title in 1945 and is soon sold off to Boston.
Everybody busted their ass to have a good year with the Browns, so he gets sold to a contender. And that's the truth.
Tired of being left out of the post-war boom, owner Richard Muckerman, who had only purchased the team a few years earlier, cut his losses in 1949, selling his interest to the DeWitt brothers. Bill and Charlie DeWitt already had a history with the Browns in the team's front office. They also brought energy, ideas, and drive to an organization that was in need of all three. And while the team improved a little in the late 40s, the Browns lacked the star players and strong farm system that separated the game's haves from the have-nots. Indeed, despite the DeWitt's best efforts, each opening day seemed closer to Groundhog's Day, with one rebuilding season leading to another as the 1950s approached. But with the dawning of a new decade came the arrival of a new owner, one who understood the only way to change things up was to shake things up. His name was Bill Veeck. The team was in a holding pattern, stuck in a rut, and there weren't many people better equipped to shake things up than Bill Veeck. Boisterous, unconventional, brilliant, and uncompromising, Veeck was worth his weight in adjectives. Prior to bringing his unique brand of team ownership to St. Louis, he had owned the Cleveland Indians, steering them to a World Series in 1948, and was betting on being able to replicate that success in St. Louis. In 1951, after buying an 80% stake in the team, Veeck wasted no time putting his indelible and undeniable stamp on the club and the game of baseball. Nobody's fool, Veeck also saw things for what they were. He understood that only one team in each league could win the pennant and capture the public's imagination each year.
First of all, he moved his family into Sportsman's Park, which is quite a sacrifice. But he felt that if he was really going to give this the best shot of running the Cardinals out of town, he had to be there 24/7. And then when the Browns were out of town, he would go out to civic groups and give speeches. He wanted to tell you, come out and see the Browns. Don't sell them short. We've got a great team. We got Roy Sievers, we've got Ned Garver, we got fun at the ballpark. You've got to come down and see the new-look Browns.
When not perfecting his impression of a one-man PR shop, Veeck was beginning the business of shaping the team in his image. He improvised and experimented, pushing boundaries and exploring the pliability of the game's long-honored rules and norms. It quickly became obvious. The only thing that was out of bounds for Veeck was playing it safe. He immediately went to work stirring up drama with that constant thorn in the Browns' side, the Cardinals, by hiring Redbirds mainstays Marty Marion and Rogers Hornsby as coaches and Dizzy Dean as an announcer. Veeck also decided red wasn't his favorite color to decorate with, festooning Sportsman's Park only in Browns memorabilia. To attract casual baseball fans, Veeck pulled out all the stops, introducing jazz bands, bat days, even bringing in acrobats and clowns to create a circus-like atmosphere that P.T. Barnum would have been proud of. And of course, Veeck himself was the ringmaster.
And that was Bill Veeck. He would connect with people in the stands. He would sit with people. He'd buy them sodas. He'd buy them beers.
Yeah, it was not just a phony thing. I think he was really trying to find out what made the fans tick. Even then, even though he had been in the game and knew it A to Z, he still enjoyed talking to the fans.
But wins, and by extension fans, were proving harder and harder to come by in 1951. So on August 19th, Veeck unveiled what would be his biggest, or perhaps his smallest, publicity stunt of them all.
There would be cake and ice cream for everybody and all this. I mean, he had regularly had kind of different events through the year, but this was going to be something special. And this big cake comes rolling out between games. And everybody thinks, is there a bathing beauty in it? But no, out pops Eddie Gaedel, 3'7" player.
And Gaedel popped out of the cake with a little bat on his shoulder wearing uniform number 1/8. And we saw our scorecards when the first game started that there was this number 1/8 Gaedel on the roster of the Browns as a substitute with no position. We saw the 1/8, looked at our scorecard, it was the same 1/8. We still thought it was just a gag that they had put him on the scorecard to tie in with the guy popping out of the cake. So now the second game starts, and it's an old story, but at the bottom of the first inning, they announced Gaedel batting for Frank Sauché.
Field announcer Bernie Ebert says, and for the Browns, batting for Frank Sauché, number 1/8, Eddie Gaedel. Here comes a midget out, swinging two little bats. And Ed Hurley umpiring, big, tough Irishman from Boston, arms folded like this. He looked at the Browns bench and for Taylor, and Zach comes running out. Zach had a habit of pulling up his pants leg. He's got the telegram in his hand. And I'll say this for Hurley. Hurley, I'm sure, could have stuffily overruled us, but a rule is a rule is a rule. He looked at it.
The umpire says, play a ball. It's legit. So they throw 4 pitches. They make Kane throw overhand. Swift tries to get down. 4 balls. Eddie Gaedel walks to first base. When he gets to first base, the crowd laughs. And I think suddenly he realized, my gosh, I've accomplished it. Nobody got hurt. And Jim Deltzing comes in to run for him, and very patronizingly, he patted Deltzing on his rear.
He took a bow and went back to the dugout, and his career was history.
After the game, when the reporters were talking to Eddie, one of the reporters said, Eddie, you lived every boy's dream and you didn't even swing the bat. Why not? And Eddie responded, well, Mr. Veeck told me there was a sniper on the roof that would shoot me dead if I swung the bat.
But it did cause some heartburn. Some of the players resented it. It was soon just one of those things that got tacked onto the things that Bill Veeck got the other owners mad at him.
Infuriated by Veeck's audacity, American League president Will Harridge immediately moved to strike Gaedel's at-bat from the record books. But history would not be denied. And the following year, the league reconsidered and officially re-entered Gaedel's only at-bat. His moment in the sun and his career on-base percentage of 1,000 would find a place in the game's annals after all. Even though he only wore it once, even Gaedel's uniform would be part of a richer story. The uniform was borrowed from the team's bat boy, Bill DeWitt Jr., the son of Browns executive Bill DeWitt Sr.
With the preparations for this, Veeck recognized about a week or so out that he didn't have a uniform small enough for the actor he had hired, Mr. Gaedel, to come in and perform the stunt, so to speak. And Mr. DeWitt had the answer very quickly. He said, well, it's not a problem to get a small uniform. We order one for my 9-year-old son every year as the bat boy. I'll just grab one of his. This bat boy, Bill DeWitt Jr., would go on to have another key place in St. Louis baseball history, as in 1996, he took ownership of the St. Louis Cardinals.
Shaking off the influences of his youth, DeWitt's Cardinals would establish themselves as a perennial power for over 2 decades, bringing 2 more World Series championships to the Gateway City. The Gaedel incident was Veeck's most infamous promotional stunt, but it wasn't his last. Knowing how much fans loved to second-guess the manager, Veeck gave Browns fans the chance to do just that. For one memorable game in 1951, he let fans in the grandstands make key managerial decisions by holding up signs saying yes or no.
The team's publicity director would come out beside the dugout, and they'd have their own posters that at different times of the game would have strategic questions on them. Should we pinch hit for the pitcher, bunt, steal, things like that.
And then there would be decisions made on the execution of the play. But his good example was Hank Arf, was a first baseman, big, old, power-hitting lumberjack first baseman of how they were in the 40s and 50s. And being a big powerhouse lumberjack, he was pretty slow. Well, Hank Arf walks. And they're playing the Philadelphia Athletics, and they were smart enough to start watching the grandstands. So what happens is, should he steal? That's the question. The majority says yes. Hank says we got to do what they said. Hank takes off. Well, he's thrown out by 25 feet.
And they made 1 or 2 silly recommendations, but not many that were silly. And the Browns won the game.
Think about all the losses in Browns history. Maybe the fans should have more authority in the game's decisions.
Veeck's creativity and his relentless drive to make ends meet extended beyond the confines of Sportsman's Park. In fact, sometimes he needed that creativity and relentless drive just to get beyond the confines of Sportsman's Park.
The itinerary they gave us Sunday night was to be at the train station at 7 o'clock Monday morning. Well, I thought that was weird because we didn't play another game until Tuesday, and we were only going to Cleveland. I said, that must be a slow train. So we get on the train, and I said, Ray, why are we leaving so darn early? We don't play for two days. He said, well, we're not going to Cleveland right away. I said, what do you mean we're not going? He said, well, you know Mr. Veeck is broke, don't you? We got to go somewhere and play a game, make some money together so he can pay us. I said, well, really? I said, well, where are we going? He said, Fort Wayne. We're going to play Fort Wayne. I said, I'm only 19 years old, but I consider myself a miniature baseball historian. What farm team is Fort Wayne? Well, nobody really says, we're playing the Fort Wayne Bloomer Girls from the Ladies League. I said, are you kidding me? And at the end of 7 innings, they had us beat 3-2. And we came in from the field, and Marty got us together, and he said, fella, I'm not kidding you. For the rest of your lives, the whole world is going to know that you were beat by a much gal, so you better get some run. Well, by the grace of God, we rallied and beat them 4-3.
Ironically, this wasn't the only time one of Veeck's off-the-field antics would yield positive results between the lines. In 1951, Veeck brought legendary Negro Leagues pitcher and future Hall of Famer Satchel Paige out of retirement. A showman in his own right, Paige delighted in setting up in the bullpen with a rocking chair for comedic effect.
You know, many people thought it was a joke, but actually, Satch was a good pitcher. He represented the Browns twice in the All-Star game. And, you know, he was in his mid-40s. But when he was called upon, he would come in and he pitched good baseball.
You'd have gotten a kick out of him when Satchel was absolute at his peak in performing. He would drive up to a ballpark and he had a convertible sedan and he had 2 horns, one mounted on each fender, must have been 3 feet in length. And when he honked that horn, you could hear it all over town.
Paige wasn't the only hurler bolstering the rotation during these bleak years. Ned Garver managed to grab his share of victories and headlines, collecting many of both in 1951, when he became only the second player in baseball history to win 20 games on a team that lost 100 or more. Veeck rewarded this historic feat by making him the Browns' highest-paid player. Against all odds, the combination of a few bright stars and the promise of Veeck's next bright idea began to have an effect at the turnstiles.
You know, the fact that he took over a losing franchise, the franchise stayed a losing franchise, but he had fun with it.
Actually, I'm prouder of that year than any year in baseball. We lost opening day, never got out of last place, and we drew more people than the Browns did when they won the pennant.
Despite Veeck's creativity and determination, larger forces were at play. The population of St. Louis had boomed after World War II, but it boomed in all the wrong places, at least from the perspective of the city's second favorite baseball team. The construction of 4 new interstates and the GI Bill's granting of money for housing to veterans encouraged growth outside the city limits. The population flourished west and south, creating suburbs that emptied the city of much of the baseball game attending populace.
I think post-World War II, St. Louis was really a city like many where, you know, they were branching out. The city proper, you know, downtown, was in some senses decaying. And that caused a lot of flight out of the city.
The city that had struggled to patronize 2 baseball teams would have to attempt it with a much smaller population living in close proximity to the ballpark. Both teams were suffering financially and were at risk to be sold, potentially to an out-of-town owner. The prospect of owning a baseball team in St. Louis was not as attractive as it once was.
Except Augie Bush thought owning a ball team might sell a lot of beer.
August A. Bush Jr., the Sultan of Suds, head of the brewing empire that bared his name, Gussie was one of the biggest and richest names in town, and it would be his money and influence that would determine which team would stay and which would go. First, he bought the St. Louis Cardinals, rescuing them from near certain bankruptcy, and then he consolidated power by purchasing Sportsman's Park for $800,000 from an increasingly desperate Bill Veeck. Knowing he couldn't compete with the deep pockets and long-reaching connections of the Anheuser-Busch-backed Redbirds, Veeck looked to other cities. Originally, Veeck wanted to move the Browns back to Milwaukee. When that fell through, he set his sights on Baltimore. But fed up with Veeck's shenanigans, the other American League owners denied the transfer. It wasn't that they didn't want the Browns in Baltimore, they simply didn't want Veeck anywhere. Out of options, Veeck reluctantly sold the team to prominent Baltimore attorney and baseball lover Clarence Miles. Veeck later commented, "Suffering is overrated. It doesn't teach you anything." And so the club's fate was sealed and their departure imminent.
I wrote a letter to Veeck, and I still have a copy of it. I might have been about 13 when he moved the team, and he never answered. But I was very cruel in the letter that he had sold us down the river and all of that. But of course, I didn't realize the economics of the thing, where the Cardinals really forced him to move. And even though he owned the ballpark, he had to sell the ballpark to the Cardinals to pay the bills. And the American League was probably on the verge of taking the franchise away from him if he didn't move them or didn't sell them.
But Baltimore wasn't all that eager to shoulder the baggage of the Browns' scattered and slightly tattered legacy. When the club first took to the field as the newly named Orioles, only the familiar color scheme remained. The name, logo, and team history would remain behind.
Unfortunately, the Baltimore Orioles feel as though their franchise begins in 1954 and do not track or trace the history of their franchise as the Browns prior to 1954.
Instead of looking back, Baltimore is in a holiday mood, looking ahead to big things from its new Orioles.
The tentacles were cut, and the Browns are the team that are without a franchise. The Browns were buried and died in St. Louis.
The Browns had effectively been erased from the game of baseball. Of course, some things, no matter how hard you try to erase them, have a way of sticking around, of refusing to be forgotten. The Browns may have left St. Louis, but St. Louis never really left the Browns.
It's interesting to look at the Browns story and to look at Cardinal Nation today. If I were looking at it from today, I'm like, oh, people just look on the Browns and they're, like they're a blip in the history of the city, and people make fun of them. But, I also think they were kind of like the lovable losers in a way.
I tend to gravitate more towards the lovable side than the loser side because our city clearly loved them.
That's the beauty of the Browns. There's all these stories, all these characters.
We're finding a new generation of fans that are interested in the Browns because just, they are so unique. There's just this recognition that they're not making any more St. Louis Browns. There's not teams like that anymore. There's not stories like that. You can't make up a story like the story we have for the Browns.
To the larger world of baseball, they've never been much more than a trivia answer or a punchline. But their often down but never quite out spirit seems to have left a lasting impression on the people of St. Louis. To the generations of fans who watched them play, they weren't jokes or bums or losers. They were men who showed up every day at the ballpark with the will, if not always the talent, to win, and provided a city with a distraction at periods in our country's history where any distraction was a welcome one. Those fans passed their affection and their memories along to the point where now, more than half a century after their last game, former players and fans, including many who were born after the team left town, gather to celebrate the accomplishments and the unique character of the St. Louis Browns. So while they may be a small footnote in the history of baseball, they loom quite large in the collective memory of St. Louis. For a time, they were the second team in America's fourth largest city. They were the team that gave us the immortal phrase, first in shoes, first in booze, and last in the American League. They were the team of George Sisler and Eddie Gaedel. They were the ultimate underdog story that never quite got the chance to be resolved. They were the St. Louis Browns, and they played baseball here once.
was about 9 years old, my dad brought me to, he said, oh, we're going to go watch Dizzy Dean pitch. And so we go out there to Sportsman's Park, and oh my, look at this field. Look at those ball players. They're real. And the people cheering for them and everything. I said, that's what I want to do.
I have a soft spot in my heart for St. Louis and the Browns, because the Browns gave me a chance. You know, I mean, this old farm boy, they took me and gave me an opportunity to go to spring training and go to Class D, start in, got 4 years in the minor leagues, and eventually got to the big leagues. That was big in my life. That was big in my life. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to play ball. The St. Louis Browns gave me that chance.
Who was your agent back then, Roy?
Me. We didn't have no agents. I wish I did.
Is it true that they told you whether you signed that contract or not, Roy?
Yeah, that's right.
We can finish last.
They always said we can finish last with you, we can finish last without you. What do you want to do? I said, I'll sign the contract.
It was just great to be with the Browns and such great ball players as Ned Garber and Roy Severs and the rest of the group. There were some really good ball players on the Browns. There were 8,500 minor league players trying to get 400 spots in the major leagues. And Cocos, and Linhart, and Billy Hunter, and Bobby Young, Clint Courtney, people like that, they could play. But you know what? You're playing some pretty good people too. Like when you play the Yankees, they got 5 Hall of Famers on their team. So the competition was really good at that time, and I was just lucky to get up there and be amongst them. Thank you very much.